Chapter 2. Get in where you fit in. As expected, David was rebuffed as he attempted to get Linda to show him around. Not enough coolness points, I suppose, Ryuga thought to himself as he watched the spectacle. In general, the queens were surrounded by the jocks, who acted as sort of a hovering royal guard. Any male who didn't meet the requirements for coolness, as labeled by either group, would be intimidated and possibly beaten into retreat. Somehow, Akira had made her way squarely into the middle of the hornet's nest. In fact, it seemed as if both groups were actively fighting to impress her. Ryuga watched intently for the entirety of the first day as the queen bee regaled Akira with her exploits. Ryuga observed no less than 5 switch-ups in a single conversation. He was convinced that Akira was doing it on purpose to keep the others guessing. Occasionally, as if she could feel his gaze, Akira would steal a glance towards him, always a warm smile on her face as she did so. This in turn ignited a fuzzy spark in Ryuga's chest, but unfortunately, this was usually soured by overwhelming malice being directed his way from the other boys, particularly the jocks. Geez, we're only 15, 16? What's with all the drama? Ryuga would think to himself. Still, he couldn't help but feel secretly pleased. Even Tarad seemed annoyed, and he was known for his cool demeanor, even when he was harassing others. By day 3, it was pretty clear that Akira had absolutely no intention of boxing herself into just one social clique. She would involve herself with Linda during the morning, speak to Ryuga every day before lunch and occasionally after school, and hang out with both the jocks and the queens after class. And strangely enough, it had become the new norm. This was probably due to the fact that this forced grouping was never actually spoken about. There were no conscious conversations about it, so the subject of choosing was difficult to breach in passing. Perhaps it was simply due to the fact that Akira herself showed absolutely no desire to belong to anyone. In fact, the only person she actively showed an interest in was Ryuga. Of all the people in the class, he was the only one she would take time out of her day to interact with. Their conversations were always short, but meaningful. During their chats, Akira had managed to learn his middle name, his favorite hobby, reading, and that he was an only child. These weren't necessarily closely guarded secrets. Rather, because he kept to himself and often rebuffed anyone who tried to get too close, no one in the class knew much of anything about Ryuga in general. On the 3rd day, while on his way home, Ryuga was followed by Tarad and his group, who waited until he turned a corner to accost him.
Hey, look who it is,
Tarad said so emphatically that Ryuga could imagine the sneer on his face. Still, Ryuga paid him no mind and kept walking.
Hey, I know you hear me, you little scrub,
Tarad said, placing his hand on Ryuga's shoulder, the same hand that was quickly slapped away as Ryuga kept walking.
You little shit! Watch yourself!
Benji, the 3rd man in Tarad's jockstrap squad, screamed as he lunged forward. Benji pushed Ryuga hard into a nearby wall, pressing his face against the cold concrete before flipping him around forcefully.
Tarad wants to talk to you! Don't go ignoring him!
It takes 4 people to talk to me? Sounds like Tarad's got a codependency problem, Ryuga retorted. He wasn't exactly sure why he said it in a time like this. It was obvious what was to come. But before the words could be corralled, they were spoken.
What the hell did you just say?
Benji said as he reared back to punch Ryuga.
Stop. I'll handle this,
Tarad said, stepping forward as he pushed Benji to the side.
Don't get beside yourself just because she makes an effort to talk to you. She's just being nice, you little twerp. If you know it's good for you, you'll keep your hands to yourself,
Tarad said, a stern look upon his face. Ryuga didn't respond or even register that he acknowledged Tarad in any way. Instead, he simply stared. Tarad wasn't really sure what he saw in Ryuga's eyes that annoyed him, but there was something about this kid that really agitated him. Just his face. It was like He didn't understand or observe the pecking order. He'd let Ryuga slide because he thought the boy understood to a degree, but perhaps it was time to teach him a lesson. Tarad turned to leave, but it was a feint. Instead, he reared back to catch Ryuga off guard with a swift, powerful punch to the gut. Ryuga was completely unprepared, the blow sinking deep into his abdomen and knocking the air out of him.
You little shit! I'll show you exactly where you stand with me.
As Ryuga fought to catch his breath, Tarad hit him with a powerful cross which knocked him first to his knees and then to the ground, face first. Tarad followed up with several kicks to the abdomen, adding insult to injury as the pain overcame Ryuga so badly that he thought he'd pass out.
Don't break anything. Just bruise him up. Really bad.
Tarad said as he stepped back and put his hands into his pockets. The other 3 jockstraps stepped forward and began stomping and kicking Ryuga, who was forced to curl up into fetal position. Several minutes later, Ryuga was barely conscious, his face and arms badly swollen, blood seeping from lacerations and cuts on his hands and arms. Ryuga could scarcely keep his eyes open as he watched the group walk off, leaving him bruised and battered. Soon, he could no longer keep his eyes open, his body racked with pain from head to toe as he succumbed to weariness. Usually, his mind was a place Ryuga dreaded to descend into, but there, in this time of discomfort, he found solace. He could hear her voice, his mother's voice, and though he couldn't make out her words, he had a feeling she was saying something along the lines of, "It will be okay, honey." Ryuga wasn't really sure how long he'd been out, but he remembered waking up with the taste of blood in his mouth. His legs felt decent, much less like jelly now, and though his abdomen was still bruised and battered, he could now find the strength to stand. He grabbed up his belongings and started the long, painful walk home. His eye was swollen from where Tarad struck him initially, and his ribcage ached with each step. Still, more than pain, what Ryuga felt was anger. It flickered within him like a dancing flame, so much so that unbeknownst to Ryuga, his eyes began to take on a peculiar countenance, almost lizard-like appearance. It was normally a 10-minute walk from his home to the school, but today it was well over an hour due to the snail's pace Ryuga was forced to keep. Each step was riddled with pain, which shot forth from every part of his body as he moved. The only thing keeping him on his feet at this point was the desire to make it home. Once he'd entered his house, he could do little else but fall over at his doorstep. He'd expended all of his energy simply getting to the house, but his mind was still racing. Something about the encounter had sent his heart aflutter. It was a different type of emotion, one that he'd never experienced before. Though his body was battered, he felt as if his soul was on fire. Those same classmates, the ones he'd regularly looked down upon for being immature, had ignited within him a sense of being alive, something that Ryuga had given up long ago. At this thought, he turned his head to look up at the picture of his mother, sitting by his front door as always. Her face carried him through many days, and the memories he'd held of her were his only solace through dark times. For him, loneliness was a constant companion. He'd already died inside, and never quite found a way to live or feel again. In fact, he was only alive now because it was a directive from his mother. She wished for him to live on, no matter what. But Ryuga couldn't deny that his days often felt like staring into a spiraling abyss of darkness. A deep and all-consuming hole that swallowed all hope, all protest, and all will to push on. For him, this reality was much more surreal than the pain which seared through his body. No physical pain could compare to the trauma that had been inflicted to his soul. He placed his hand over his eyes as the tears welled up and began to pour. It had been a while since he'd cried to himself like this. No hope. At least, that's what he thought to himself. Still, he couldn't help but think of Akira's face the second this thought creeped into his mind. Was he fooling himself, as Tarad said? Was Akira really just being nice to him out of pity? Ryuga's life was heavy enough, The real reason he sought to be alone was because he didn't like the weight of the chains others often seek to place upon each other. He struggled with so much, it wasn't worth adding any more weight to an encumbered existence. He finally got to his feet after a good cry and slowly walked towards his bathroom, lost in thought. Should he just ignore her altogether tomorrow? A part of him thought this might be a good idea, but a larger part of him really wanted to deprive Tarot of the pleasure it would bring. A part of him wanted to blatantly rebuke Tarot by flirting in his face. This was also a feeling he couldn't deny. Deep within, there was a certain degree of defiance which was beginning to churn in his stomach. Either way, he would have at least a day to settle his feelings on the matter. Ryuga finished washing his hands and stared into the mirror, deep in thought. For a moment, he didn't recognize the eyes gazing back, but upon doing a double take, he dismissed it as fatigue. It was only 6 in the evening, but Ryuga had a long day ahead of him tomorrow. With this in mind, he decided on a simple instant dinner. Then he said his prayers and retired to his bedroom, a deep sleep overcoming him almost as soon as he closed his eyes.